Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be able to understand and deal with the concept of resource loading. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by the concept of resource loading, what are the various roles that have been performed at the time of resource loading, and what are the various activities that have been undertaken in day-to-day operational practices with respect to the resource loading. Now let's understand the concept of resource loading. The practice of filling the employee's total available hours with a task is known as the resource loading in the project management. So when we say that a particular project or a certain activity is being undertaken in a business organization, one has to see that the number of working hours that have been provided for an individual, all those working hours should be fulfilled, should be complied very effectively, and accordingly, the number of available working hours should be consumed. And hence, when the number of employees are been working in an organization and all the working hours have been utilized in a very effective way, such consideration is called as the concept of resource loading. And this particular resource loading is equally applicable or is equally used in resource or the project management also. In a concern or in a basic concern, if an employee is scheduled at 100% and needs to fulfill for another employee who is sick, then accordingly the available capacity that has been vacated of 100% should be completely utilized with respect to the 100% availability and 100% vacancy. And hence, resource loading is a certain amount of concept which focuses or which specifically deals with how the activity can be replaced by one individual to another individual. And hence, such activities needs to be created in an organization about how those resources can be utilized in a very effective way. Now let's understand how do we calculate the resource loading. In order to calculate the resource loading, one has to deal with or understand the consideration as to the total amount of labor that has been required for a particular day. In a particular day, a particular labor is been expected to work for at least 8 hours. The minimum working hours for a particular or the maximum capacity of an individual to work for a situation is the 8 hours. And the available number of labors in a particular organization has to be multiplied with the number of labors available into the 8 hours of every individual working in the organization. Alternatively, calculating the amount of work required for the project or task that has been undertaken is divided by the resource availability. So, whatever number of resources are available with us, it is divided with the total working hours or the total work conditions that needs to be employed in an organization. And hence, usually less number of working hours, that is below 8 hours, is not usually preferred, and accordingly the calculation goes wrong. And hence, here in this case, calculation of resource loading is essentially important, and accordingly one has to understand or we have to see the number of amount of labor that is available per day, how many resources are there into existence, and what is the maximum capacity. The maximum capacity with respect to the 8 working hours and the availability of resources as to either increase or decrease in the number of labors. Now there might be a question at these particular stages, what does a resource loaded schedule serve? So in this case, the resource loaded schedule serves a certain load of the business processes or certain activities which are required to be performed, whatever may be the cost. Whether the cost of the organization either increases or whether the cost of organization either decreases, everything has to be allocated, and accordingly, based on those considerations, the majority of business loads needs to be identified. So in this particular case, the resources may either increase or the resource may either decrease. And simultaneously, the resource loading structure focuses on how those resources can be utilized in a very effective way. These particular resources may be either a cost to the organization or maybe a saving to the organization. Now let's understand what are the critical elements that have been associated with respect to the resource allocation. Number one is the staff meeting on a regular basis. So in a particular case, when we see that a resource is been identified and they needs to be complied, a regular staff meeting is needed to be undertaken. And when a staff meeting is been undertaken on a regular basis, there is a confidence and a proper communication about how they will be performing their respective jobs or assigned responsibilities. Communication of all those activities within the organization is essentially required, and based on those considerations, the resources needs to be allocated or it needs to be adjusted. Now, let's take an example at this particular stage. That is, in a particular staff meeting, one comes to a conclusion that a particular labor or a particular employee will not be available on a certain day. So, When the notice or the information is given advanced in a certain period, then at that particular stage, the necessary resources can be altered at a several point of time, and accordingly, necessary adjustments can be done with respect to the availability of resources that can be accommodated or that can be used. Work on other projects than the employee is been assigned. At a certain stages, the employee is also been understand or utilized to work on a different perspectives or different projects. So for those particular consideration, how do we assign a job for a certain individual, and what activities can be conducted along with the primary activity also needs to be ascertained, and then accordingly the critical element needs to be identified. The time that has been spent for previously assignment or the current assignments. A certain employee is been assigned or it has been set with a certain jobs that has been there into existence, and based on those considerations, one has to see that what is the actual time spent by an employee for a particular current job or an additional job that he needs to complete. So for a previous job or for a current job or an additional job that has been scheduled to an employee, what time that has been spent and what resources are being utilized. And hence, that's the concept of resource loading. Project-related meetings and impromptu conversations. Now, the conversation between the people, between the team also needs to be identified, and accordingly, the meeting should be of a point of an healthy discussion, which is always project-related. When we see that resource loading is a particular concern, we should always identify and see that whatever resource that we have, either a resource related to a machine or a resource to a human being, it does not get overloaded, and accordingly there is no hamper in the production cycle or the activity that has been undertaken. And hence, the critical element as to workload needs to be identified, and accordingly the regular and frequent meetings needs to be undertaken. Taking time off from the work. So at certain stages or certain intervals, one has to identify and see that what are the various frequent intervals that have been undertaken by the individual. A certain layoff, a certain free time, a certain leisure time that has been associated, and based on those considerations, the time off from a free work is been assigned by a certain individual. And based on this consideration, the critical element needs to be identified, and accordingly, the project allocation activity needs to be undertaken. Restroom breaks and much more. So accordingly, in a specified time period. So in our previous example, we have understood what is the scheduled time for a particular individual to complete a certain activity. For this particular activity, the scheduled time may be 8 hours for a particular individual. Within these particular 8 hours, the individual has to complete a certain amount of job, and out of those 8 hours, he may occupy or he may consume certain amount of time for his restroom, for his breaks, for his time off, and much more activities, that is the lunch and so on. So for those particular consideration, the resource loading activity or the time frame either differs, that is either increases or either decreases. Now let's take an example, or how do we implement the resource loading in our day-to-day organizations. So teams consistently missing the deadlines because they have more vital tasks than they have handled. In this particular case, one has to understand that how those particular activities are being conducted in a business organization. At a certain stages, the deadlines may be either achieved or the deadlines may be either missed by the respective organizations or the certain concerns. And for those particular consideration, the implementation of resource allocation activity is essentially important. That is, which activity is needed to be prioritized, how those activities can be consistently conducted, and what are the various vital tasks that can be undertaken in the business organization. And hence, for those consideration, proper setting of deadlines and achieving those particular deadlines targeted to be met is essentially or equally important. Customer complaint rises as the quality of work declines. So whenever there is an increase in the customer complaint, it needs to be assumed that the quality of work is automatically declining. That is, whenever the quality is not good, the customer is not happy with the product that has been delivered, then accordingly several customer complaints may rise, and it may create a dissatisfaction level in the terms of or in the minds of consumers. Observing the colleagues' behavior and longer working hours or too many times. In this particular stage, one has to observe about how the colleagues have been working, what are the number of working hours they have been spending on a certain consideration, and what are the number of working hours they have been spending on the actual productivity or on their leisure time. So observation of colleagues' time along with the working hours is essentially important, and accordingly we need to identify what resources needs to be loaded and what resources needs to be eliminated. People dismiss fresh projects and ideas, placing them on the back burner. So in this case, whatever fresh projects are there into existence, one has to understand and say that which project should be prioritized first and how allocation of resources should be undertaken for a certain amount of project. So based on the availability of that particular project, based on the availability of resources, certain idea needs to be implemented, they needs to be placed, and accordingly the adjustment between the available resources and the existing or the new resources should be identified. As a resultant of these particular opportunities and they have been turned down or situations, your revenue either increases or the revenue of the organization either decreases. So, with the changes in the opportunities in an organization, the revenue of the company either increases and decreases, and accordingly, the profit margin also differs. So, the organization should always try to identify where the positive opportunity lies and how the additional revenue to the business can be created in order to adjust the resources as and when it is being implemented. Because of now, here in this case, there should be a proper clear understanding about what duties and responsibilities have been allocated and how simpler tasks can be achieved in a business organization. So, frequently, various team meetings should be conducted. A proper healthy conversation between the employees, peers, colleagues should be organized, and accordingly, the resource loading activity should be implemented. Now, let's understand what is the formula for calculation of resource loading. The formula for resource loading is as shown in the respective slide. That is, resource loading is equal to number of hours of work per time per period divided by the hours of capacity per time per period. So, whatever number of hours that have been completed or that have been undertaken for a certain work for a specified time period, it is the total of all those particular working hours to be taken, and accordingly it has to be divided by the hours of capacity. That is, actual work divided by the capacity of a particular individual. These particular hours of capacity per time period may differ. That is, for an individual, it may be 8 hours. For a few individuals, it may be 8.5 hours or 9 hours. For few individuals, it may be 7 hours or 6 hours. So, it differs from individual to individual, and all the average of those particular calculation needs to be undertaken. Now, let's take an example for the formula calculation. That is, we anticipate a resource loaded to 75% of capacity to do 30 hours of a scheduled work per week. That is 40 hours to a certain capacity. That is 75% for a 30 hours and 40 hours for a 100 capacity, or 6 hours per day as a project manager. The remaining 10 hours of that particular week are supposed to be spent on that things that aren't on the schedule or aren't relevant to the project, that is training, department meetings, and so on. And hence, at this particular consideration, the calculation moves with the 75 to 30 and 100 to 40 and so on. So accordingly, what number of working hours have been spent, whatever number of working hours have been calculated, and accordingly, one has to identify the formula for calculation. So the formula for calculation will be the duration, that is the number of days of work that has been undertaken, which is equal to the total working hours, that is in terms of an hours, whether it may be 30 hours, 40 hours, and so on, which is divided by the availability of the hours per day. So in a particular week, you may have around 6 working days or 5 working days, and out of those particular 5 or 6 working days, the per hour work that has been undertaken, that is for either 8 hours or 9 hours and 7 hours and so on. So in this way, the valuation or the various values has to be put in a particular formula, and the calculation needs to be undertaken. Next example is, for example, if you have a 12-hour assignment and you have to work for it for every day, the task will be taking 3 days to complete for a certain work. That is 4 divided by 3 or 4 multiplied by 3, which gives a certain assignment for a 12 hours completed in 3 days. So in this way, every year or every day you work for a 4 hours, then accordingly the 12-hour assignment can be completed in 3 days. Now let's conclude towards this particular topic. From this particular session, we can understand the actual hours that has been spent on the project is almost the working hours that have been planned. So resource allocation or resource loading is a type of concept which specifically focuses on what number of our working hours have been utilized, how the job or the task is being completed, and what is the plan of action that is being undertaken for completing a certain task. Compounding the delays that has been caused by the underestimation of availability. So the available resources may be either increased or decreased, and based on those particular availability, the compounding may either increase or decrease, and hence estimation of effective working hours with respect to how the job or the work or the task can be completed and in what way it needs to be utilized or minimized should be conducted in a better concern. So now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood the concepts of what do we mean by resource loading? What are the various factors or planning that is being required when resource loading is implemented for goods and services in a certain organization, and how to implement the resource loading? Simultaneously, we have also dealt with various formulas that are required for calculation of the resource loading and how the value can be computed in terms of resource loading. I hope you must have enjoyed your learning at this particular stage. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.